Well, the focus of the entire webinar is on planning, and Greg did a nice job of explaining how the oak guidelines provide opportunities for planners to be involved in conserving oak woodlands. I'm going to give a very, very brief overview of some of the biology and ecology of California's oak woodlands. We had a whole webinar series on just this topic just about a year ago, which digs into this in a lot of details. The URL in front of you there, ucanr.org/oaks, has lots of information on tree planting, on acorn production, on nutrient cycling, on watershed principles, a lot of the processes that are important parts of the oak ecosystem. A lot of those are explained there. So I'll just go through very, very quickly some of the key points to think about. Greg started to talk about how much of the state is in public and private ownership. California's oak woodlands cover about 10% of California. They're really marked by having an overstory of trees in the Quercus species, Quercus genera, and an understory of predominantly exotic annual grasses and forbs. The major land use of California's oak woodlands are domestic livestock. 2/3 of all the oak woodlands in the state are grazed by domestic livestock. Next week, Sheila Berry will talk to us a little bit about the conservation values of working landscapes, so that'll be an important topic that she'll talk about next week. Now, even though California is about 50% publicly owned, as Greg pointed out, oak woodlands are mainly privately owned. About 80% of them are privately owned. Bill Tichy will talk a lot about the biodiversity values and some of the wildlife habitat elements that are important. But one of the reasons why we are so concerned about the oak woodlands is because they do have the highest biodiversity of any broad habitat type in the state. Can overlay that map on top of the one that Greg showed earlier with the ownership types, but oak woodlands are really spread throughout the state. And we have people on the call here that are all the way down in Southern California, San Diego and LA, Ventura counties, and then we have people all the way up in the North Coast in Humboldt and Del Norte counties. So we do cover the whole state, the transverse ranges, the Sierra Nevada foothills, the Central Coast, the coastal foothills. So oak woodlands really are spread throughout the state. I'm going to go through just some very brief characteristics of some of the broad woodland species that we find in the state. There's really two broad categories, the white oaks, and there's 4 major species that we'll be dealing with in the white oak group, and in the evergreen and the black oak group, there'll be 4 major species we'll be talking about there. The blue oak is the most widespread of any of the broad oak woodland species. It has mixed sprouting, so it relies on sprouting as a regeneration strategy, but it varies. On some of the drier sites, it doesn't sprout as well, and large trees actually tend to be very poor sprouters. Blue oak, as do all the white oaks, have an acorn that matures in 1 year, so the flowers that are pollinated in the springtime will produce acorns that same in that fall. So one growing season does produce acorns. Blue oak is deciduous. It loses its leaves in the fall. Relatively shade intolerant, so they do not regenerate very well or grow very well in their own shade. They do fairly well with low intensity fires and are found on pretty hot and dry sites. Interior live oak is in the live oak or black oak group, a little bit taller than the blue oak. It is a very vigorous sprouter. It has acorns that mature in the 2nd year, so the acorns, the pollen and the flowers that are pollinated in the springtime produce acorns in a year from the following fall. They are evergreen, so that they do have leaves on the tree year round. They are somewhat more shade tolerant, so the regeneration will tolerate some shade, so they can persist in a somewhat denser canopy covers, and they're found on a wide variety of sites. So we do see interior live oak spread throughout the state. Coast live oak, somewhat similar in appearance, has more of a cupped leaf form that's, as the name suggests, found throughout the coast of California, from Southern California up into the North Bay and southern part of the North Coast. Now these acorns do mature in 1 year. It says deciduous. They're not deciduous. They're mistake on the slide. They are somewhat shade tolerant, and they're quite tolerant of hot fires. They're found in a wide variety of different types as well. Valley oak may be my favorite tree. It's one of the largest. It's in the white oak group. It's one of the largest oaks in the world. Very rapid grower. Tends to be found on very good agricultural sites. It's because it is found on good agricultural sites. Much of the original extent of valley oak habitat is no longer around. Its acorns do mature in 1 year. It is deciduous. It's a little more shade tolerant than blue oak. It's not that tolerant of hot fires. Much of the Central Valley, the Salinas Valley, the Santa Clara Valley, much of the Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area was valley oak habitat. I personally live in Davis, and the Jays have planted some beautiful valley oaks in my front yard, and they have phenomenal growth rate on these areas that were formerly deep, well-drained agricultural soils. So they can really grow quickly. Engelmann oak is maybe our most threatened oak habitat. Tom Scott is on the call, and he'll actually be joining us in one of the follow-up discussions here. It's found throughout Southern California. It's a variable sprouter. It's considered semi-deciduous. It does hold leaves throughout the year, but they do tend to fall off. So we can class it as semi-deciduous, kind of midway between a live oak and something like a blue oak, where all the leaves fall off. Does very well in hot fires and does resprout from that. And a lot of conservation work has gone on to protecting and conserving Engelmann oak habitat. Other oaks, and some of you on this call are interested in some of these. The California black oak, found in association with the mixed conifer and also in the North Coast, and Oregon white oak. These, as well as canyon live oak, all three of these are found on somewhat more productive forest sites, a little moister areas. The California Forest Practice Rules would have more jurisdiction over these species. They are considered in management of commercial forest lands. A little bit about the distribution of the different broad habitat types. These classifications of different oak woodland types are based on the California Wildlife Habitat Relationship Systems, which is a vegetation classification system. The blue oak and the blue oak foothill pine covers almost 45% of the state. It's the most broadly expansive type of oak woodland habitat. The montane hardwood, which is would include the interior live oak, canyon live oak, also some black oak, pure black oak, about a third of the state. Coastal oak woodlands, where Bill Tichy works, and Bill will be joining us in just a moment here, that would be mainly the coast live oak. Valley oak woodland, even though it's such a charismatic species and fairly widespread, it's only about 1% of the broad oak woodland communities are valley oak woodland habitats. I'm going to go through some of the broad ecosystem processes that take place on oak woodlands. And as planners, this is something really that you need to take into consideration as you're thinking about planning tools to maintain functional oak woodlands. And Greg gave a good motivation to that in his talks there. But we think that probably pre-European settlement, those are a few characteristics of what oak woodlands may have had facing them. Probably a more widely distributed perennial herbaceous layer. Many of the understory species, grass and herbs, forbs in the oak woodlands are introduced Mediterranean annuals. But we think there probably was a much more widely distributed perennial herbaceous layer. Fire interval, next week we'll talk a little bit about the role of planning and protecting against wildfire threats. I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit, but fires in oak woodlands were quite common and regular, low intensity, high frequency fires. We think oak woodlands probably were more open as a result of the thinning effect from regular low intensity fires because of the perennial herbaceous layer and the more open canopy cover. We think the soil moisture may have been higher later into the growing season. So the moisture regimes in oak woodlands are quite different now than they were during the time before European settlement of California. Lower soil bulk density, higher organic matter in the soil. Greg talked about the importance of riparian zones. We think these were probably denser and more diverse than they are right now. And herbivore density was probably lower. So that's just some characteristics of the kinds of ecosystem processes that we're facing oak woodlands. I hit most of those features right there about the herbaceous composition, but we think the perennials played a much more important role historically, and that has an effect on regeneration. That has an effect on fire relationships. Has an effect on soil moisture and hydrology. Grazing processes, Sheila will say a lot more about that. We had some very, very high uses of livestock in the late 1880s. There are both positive and negative effects from grazing. Sheila will get into this in a lot more detail, but certainly livestock can play a management tool in accomplishing some ecosystem goals. And I'm not going to steal her thunder there, but I just put it there because grazing is an important part of the ecosystem processes in oak woodlands. Forage production, how much grass is produced, has a lot to do, and Charlie Ragusi's on the call right here. Charlie is a retired professor emeritus from UC Davis and has done a lot of work in this area. Certainly the amount of canopy cover has an effect on shading and how much grass production there is. We have some recommendations in some of our publications that are listed on the website about the relationship of canopy cover and forage production in different rainfall belts and different oak woodland types, the blue oak or the live oak types. Nutrient cycling, Charlie's also worked in this area. There's been quite a bit of work both at our Hopland and our Sierra Research and Extension Centers of the university. But under the oak canopy, there's higher carbon levels, lower soil bulk density, higher nutrient content as a result of the leaf fall and the deeper rooting capacity of oak trees. Some of the nutrients enhancement under oak woodlands, actually some work at the Sierra Field Station showed that the positive effect, even after the trees were removed for range improvement purposes, persisted for 10 to 15 years, even after the trees were removed as the roots decomposed. Oak regeneration, this is something a lot of planters are really concerned about, and Greg talked about the importance of an array of regeneration or size classes to ensure a healthy oak stand. In general, the blue oak, Engelmann oak, and valley oak have a shortage of sapling-sized trees. Lots of acorns are produced intermittently, but they do germinate and tend to grow well. There doesn't seem to be a shortage of acorns falling and germinating and becoming young seedlings in oak woodlands, but the ones that actually survive and make it up in the 3 to 10 foot size class tends to be limiting. We'll talk about this quite a bit when we go out in the field, and we have a whole bunch of publications dealing with the ways in which you can try to recruit larger tree sizes. Stump sprouting is an important management tool for regeneration, especially some of the smaller size trees. So a thinning project perhaps for reducing fuel threats, or perhaps landowners that are trying to generate some income. If the trees under 8 inches are thinned, those tend to sprout very vigorously, especially in blue oak, which doesn't sprout quite as well. Fire suppression, the change in the annual grass understory, and then high rodent herbivory, and we'll see this at the field stations as well, all have an effect on consuming young oak seedlings. There's a variety of ways in which regeneration can take place, either through direct seeded acorns. Doug McCreary, who's an emeritus extension specialist, he'll actually be on our call in a few weeks talking about oak ordinances, but Doug has done a lot of work on collecting acorns, and the take-home message is for restoration projects, acorns should be collected from the trees, not the ground. They have much higher survival, and they should be stored and right after they're harvested for best success in germination and regeneration projects. Seedlings, Doug has also done a lot of work on that, but it's quite important when planting seedlings that there's good weed control, either through mulching or hoeing or herbicides, but maintaining moisture for the developing seedling is a very important feature. Tree shelters have been looked at in many restoration projects. Many planning documents do talk about some of these tools to maintain oak trees. And the tree shelters have proven to provide a real desirable microclimate for developing seedlings. I'm going to have just a couple more slides here. Royce Larson next week will talk about watershed principles, but as Greg mentioned, the riparian zones in oak woodlands are one of the most important variables in maintaining functioning ecosystems. So paying close attention to those makes a very important is very important for planners to consider. Fire frequency. Native Americans used fire as a management tool. Lightning fires were quite common in oak woodlands, and then ranchers certainly used fire as a management tool as well. But we believe 5 to 15 year fire frequency was quite common, so low intensity, high frequency fires, and in recent years with concerns about liability, smoke management, fire suppression is much more the norm right now, and we have changed the fire return interval to being much longer now with high intensity fires taking place. And many of the fires in Southern California certainly were in oak woodlands, and very high-intensity fires. And with that, I think I'm going to just provide a lead-in to Bill's talk about wildlife and wildlife biodiversity. This is one of the most important characteristics of California's oak woodlands, and I'm going to stop right there and